I'm going to be talking to John Bistline, who's with the Electric Power Research Institute based in California, about some of the how the role that utilities play in electrification of the economy. Particularly, some of that's driven by, decarbonization policy, climate policy. Some of it's driven by technology change, but clearly we're in the middle of change. And John has some interesting perspectives on that. So, John, welcome to the interview.
Great, happy to be here.
Now, I read a piece of yours, and you were talking about the studies that estimate and model the amount of electricity that we will need as we electrify transportation, as we electrify, buildings and industry. And there's a big variation in them. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wrote an article in Joule where I tried to compare the change in electricity demand from today's levels for these different studies that aim to look at net zero emissions across the economy. And I guess I was surprised in putting that together to see that there were some scenarios that had maybe a 50% increase, while others were triple or quadruple today's levels. And I would say that wide range to some degree reflects sort of differences across countries themselves. So some economies have larger industrial bases, while others have greater shares of transport emissions that could be electrified. But ultimately, I think that the wide range really reflects differences in the models themselves that are used for these different country-specific analyses, and also the assumptions about how the future could unfold and how net zero emissions might be reached. I would say that some models make fairly pessimistic assumptions about things like energy efficiency, which would lead to higher demand, while others assume pretty large contributions from these electricity-derived fuels, things like electrolytic hydrogen, potentially synthetic hydrocarbons as well. And these sort of indirect electrification pathways, or e-fuels, as they're sometimes called, those can really drive up electricity demand, in part because the round-trip efficiencies of those pathways are pretty inefficient. So I think there was a paper recently showing that you may need 2 to 14 times more electricity for that indirect electrification pathway.
Now, given the variability in the estimates, in the modeling, and given the fact that over the last 10, 12 years, we've had fairly flat load growth in the electricity sector, if I was a utility looking at this, I'd be going, okay, I think if we're going to electrify cars and trucks and so on, okay, we're going to have some load growth. And if we're going to electrify, but how do I quantify all of that? How do I plan for it? Because utilities have to make fairly significant capital expenditures in order to meet those demands. They've got to build power generation, transmission, distribution. It seems like, has utility planning become more complex?
I would say it has. I mean, there's no substitute for really crunching the numbers when it comes to really understanding the demand side of the picture. But in addition to all of these changes on the demand side from electrification, increased efficiency, there are also a lot of changes that are happening simultaneously on the supply side too, where a lot of utilities are thinking about more integrated generation planning, transmission planning, distribution planning. You have sort of different resources coming into the mix for a lot of grids, a lot more solar, a lot more wind. There are questions about these emerging technologies that are useful in decarbonizing, whether that's CCS, hydrogen, advanced nuclear. So I would say that yes, it's become a lot more complicated. But I think the good news is that there's a lot of folks that are really thinking hard about each one of these problems, even within companies already. So it's a matter of sort of bringing all those perspectives together. And yeah, that's one thing that I really enjoy about my job, is that I get a peek into that window.
Well, speaking of the peek into the window, I've interviewed various experts, and a lot of them have talked about the changes in technologies that utilities are having to grapple with. You mentioned some on the the generation side, but there is also all sorts of new technologies for transmission and distribution. Is this a really disruptive time technology-wise for the industry?
Yeah, I think, if you were to ask people 30 years ago whether it was a disruptive time, I'm sure they would have said yes then as well. But I do think, yeah, we are on the cusp of pretty significant changes, and many changes are already, taking place. That phrase about, the future isn't evenly distributed, I think is definitely the case when it comes to power systems. Some places already have really significant penetrations of renewables. Some places already have extensive storage penetration, also deployment of distributed energy resources. So a lot of them have been dealing with these questions for quite some time now. But I think, as time moves forward, you're going to see, a lot more places around Canada, around the US, around the world, really trying to, come to grips with a lot of these changes.
Well, how important is the learning curve here? Because you mentioned that some have been grappling with some of these issues for quite a while, some less so. We know the learning curve is really important in driving down costs in areas like electric vehicles, for instance, where you learn how to do things smarter and better, and you turn loose the engineers, and it's amazing what happens. How important is that to the utility sector? And if we look at the S curve, kind of where are the bulk of the utilities? Are they at the beginning of that curve? Are they at the middle of the curve? What's your take?
Yeah, I would say that, these sort of global challenges like decarbonization require these sort of global solutions, global collaboration. And I think that the innovation, in addition to the technology side, is also on the sort of planning side and transferring best practices. So that's one thing that I like, again, about my job, is that I have a chance to interact with, a lot of stakeholders, not just in the US and Canada, but around the world. And yeah, I think transferring those learnings, what goes well, what doesn't go as well, those are really important. And I think, each sort of, location has sort of unique features as well. There's not a sort of one size fits all approach to decarbonization. And that's, both on the supply side and on the demand side too. So you mentioned different load growth projections. And, to some degree, that interacts with the sort of policies and incentives that are available in a given region. It interacts with the sort of resources and climate. So if you're in a really cold place, that might be a little bit different from a mild climate in terms of the sort of space heating, space cooling needs, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room to sort of transfer these best practices.
Now, I do a lot of reporting on electric vehicles, and so I hang out in some, sort of the EV groups on social media, because I want to see what people are talking about. And one thing, it comes up invariably, and that is somebody will say, that the load growth is going to be significant, and oh my God, we don't have enough infrastructure. We don't have enough, the infrastructure at the neighborhood level is going to need to be beefed up, and we're just not going to be able to handle the load that will come with the additional EVs. And my stock response to that is every utility I talk to, an expert says, no, the utilities know what's coming. They're planning. They're not going to be caught flat-footed by this thing, and they have their plans, or soon will have plans in place to deal with this increased load and their infrastructure issues. Is that a fair comment, or what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and a pretty good take on it as well. I know that, at EPRI, we have an electric transport group that has been thinking about these issues and helping utilities plan for many decades now. And even though the sort of cost declines for batteries and for electric vehicles have been, remarkable in the last decade, they are sort of changes that a lot of people have been planning for during that time. And, I think, from my perspective of being, deeply engaged on these issues, I've seen these sort of EV sales forecasts evolve over time, and the sort of questions about, accommodating that growth, trying to figure out what sort of behavioral incentives are helpful to, enable that load flexibility that people often talk about when referring to electric vehicles and other sort of electrified end uses. So yeah, I think this is something that, not really surprising anyone. And I think a lot of that sort of proactive planning really helps.
Just to wrap up our conversation, I want to go back a bit to the load growth forecast and the contributions from efficiency and conservation. And I always find that the folks who are a little more environmentally minded place a lot of faith in efficiency and conservation to reduce the amount of generation we're going to need, going forward in 2030, 2040, 2050. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think energy efficiency, which can refer to sort of any reductions in either energy use per unit of service demand or any reductions per unit of economic activity, that's a pretty important pillar of any sort of decarbonization scenario. And part of that efficiency is due to structural changes that happen in the economy. So things like vehicle miles traveled aren't growing as much as GDP, or heated floor space doesn't grow as much as GDP. And that's something that we've done both a US national electrification assessment as well as one for Canada. And with both of those, we try to decompose final energy into contributions from changes in structural activity, changes in sort of efficiency of end uses themselves, and also from electrification. So the fact that a lot of electrified end uses are something like 3, 4, 5 times as efficient in terms of the final energy per unit of service demand, means that you automatically have that efficiency built into the electrification trend. But yeah, that sort of other elements of efficiency is a pretty broad one as well. And it's not just sort of better windows on people's houses, but also improving the insulation of things like industrial plants, which can save something like a quarter of the energy used, depending on which industry you're talking about. So yeah, I think that efficiency also plays a pretty key role in decarbonization and goes hand in hand with the electrification trend we mentioned before.
Well, John, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time.